Hello, you fine folks at Wake Forest Presbyterian and anyone else who is just looking for a Bible study for the season of Lent. The Lenten Bible studies, is how we know them in the church, are usually quite popular. And they usually bring in more people than would be comfortable with a Zoom meeting. And it's difficult to teach with so many people you can't identify easily. So what this class is going to do for the next 5 weeks is tonight we're going to lay the foundation for the Book of Ruth. It's a little 4-chapter book in the Old Testament that comes right after the Book of Judges, and it's a fascinating little book. It's more than just a romance love story between Ruth and Boaz and everything is happily ever after. But we're going to take a look at this, and one of the things that I hope you did as you were preparing for this class is I've asked that you read through the book of Ruth at one sitting, and then go back and read the first chapter, which we will delve into more deeply next week. But today I want us to set the stage for how we might approach the book of Ruth. And I was surprised, as I usually am when I teach a Bible study, of how much about Ruth I didn't know. The surface, that's one thing. But then when you begin to ask the right questions, it takes you deeper into God's Word, and it reveals something significant to us about who God is and how God works with His chosen people. Now, let's see, I've got my notes here. I gleaned a lot of this information. I took the course of Ruth from Columbia Seminary at the end of last fall, and Chris Holmes and Brennan Breed are the professors for that. And each week of the Book of Ruth, they would have a different guest professor from various seminaries across the United States, Old Testament professors mostly. Now, there is some parts of this book that could be classified as poetry, such as the one where Ruth is giving her almost a covenant agreement with Naomi, who tells her to go back to her own home in Moab. And so this is what it says. Ruth replied after Naomi is telling her to go back to her own people in Moab. Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to abandon you, to turn back from following after you." And here we go. "Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. And wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do this to me and more, so if even death separates me from you." And Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her. She stopped speaking to her about it, and they went on their way. So that is a passage that is often used very sweetly in many, many weddings that I've done. That's one that many couples ask for as part of their wedding service. And I don't think most of them even realize that it is a covenant between two women. Now, I want you to keep that in mind, because so much of the book of Ruth has to do with women and their situation in that era of the world, an ancient world. So keep that in mind. It's going to come up again and again throughout the book of Ruth. One of the things that we do when we talk about what a foundation is in a short book like this is to look at the names and the location, set the stage, if you will, for where this story is, and it puts it into context. And we learn this in the book of Job as well. Quite often, these Old Testament books are put in a setting that is hundreds of years prior to when the story was written and told, which is interesting, because then you really have to wind up looking at the context in which the story is set. and also the context of where Israel was several hundred years later, and what that book may have said to the people at the time that it was actually written. So we have talked a little bit about poetry, and the covenant statement that I just read is often understood as poetic literature. And we can see how that is. It has a cadence to it. It's a very strong and powerful few words about a foreigner, Ruth, a Moabite woman, pledging her allegiance to her mother-in-law. Now, many people pause at that point and say, good gracious, her mother-in-law, why would she want to go back to a foreign land with her Hebrew mother-in-law and dedicate her life to caring for Naomi? That was a big deal. Now, here's what happens. It starts right out in the very beginning of that first chapter. It says it. During the days when the judges ruled. Okay. If you'll note in your Bibles, you'll see that the book of Ruth comes right after the book of Judges, which makes sense when you read that first line. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. Famine also means barrenness in the Hebrew, and is kind of like a famine is like being empty, and it's a serious thing. And then it says, a man with his wife and 2 sons went from Bethlehem of Judah to dwell in the territory of Moab. It means from the father. They were often enemies of Israel, and they fought against each other all the time, off and on. They weren't their arch enemies, but they ticked each other off a lot. Now, the Dead Sea is on the right side of Moab, in present-day Jordan, and you can see that very clearly on your map. So if you look at maps of the Bible in the time period of the Judges, you can see exactly where it's located. Now, Ruth was a foreigner. She was not Hebrew. She wasn't even vaguely a Hebrew, an Israelite woman. Now, Elimelech was the husband of Naomi. He died. I mean, the whole thing is just set up in that first paragraph. He died once they were in Moab, which provided them with the food they needed. Evidently, things were so bad back in Bethlehem of Judea that they couldn't stay. So he took his family, Naomi, their 2 sons, and went off. Elimelech, Naomi's husband, he after he died, but then I found out his name means my God is king. Here they are in a foreign land, and God is nobody like the God of Israel, that's for sure. They had lots of gods. But Elimelech's name was my God is king, better than all of yours. So in that context, these Hebrew people among the Moabites, it was significant that they did not hide who they were as Jewish Hebrew people. Naomi, which is our daughter's name, and I really love it, it means gift of joy and pleasure. It's just very pleasant, just like to be around her. She was that kind of a person, a gift of joy, and very pleasing to others. Now, Mahlon was their son, one of their sons, and he died, but his name, Mahlon, means sickly. So when you hear that, you go, who would name their kid sickly? Well, it says something about the character. Ruth's first husband was sickly. So it tells something about that relationship and about Ruth. Now, Ruth means friend, and she lives up to her name, doesn't she? My daughter-in-law's middle name is Ruth, and I just love it. It means friend. I don't know if she likes it or not, but still, every time I hear the name Ruth, I think about her, but I also think about the word friend. She was an upstanding person. Then there's Kilian, Naomi and Elimelech's second son, and Kilian means very nice and respectful. He was just a good man. And you begin to see through the meaning of the names the kind of personality of that family. Is who they were as a family. It's what they were recognized as a family. Very nice and respectful. His wife, also a Moabite woman, was named Orpah. And Orpah means fawn or long neck. Others have translated that as meaning graceful, like a fawn who runs through the forest with such grace. And, I don't know. Now, 2 sons and a husband. The husband dies. Well, if a woman has 2 sons, then she will be cared for by her sons. They will take care of her. But her husband died. Okay, you keep going. Then her 2 sons died. Don't know what they died of. We know that Mahlon was very sickly and Kilian was nice and respectful, but neither of them had children. No sons. And that's a problem, because we know that in that era, women were property to their husbands and their husbands' family. If their husbands died and there was no heir, they could then marry the next son of their husband's family. This presented some problems. Most brothers of a husband who has died don't want to marry their brother's wife, so that she can get pregnant, and the child she bears from her marriage to her brother-in-law would be technically her first husband's child. And most brothers didn't want to know that the son that they had with their dead brother's wife wasn't technically going to be theirs, and they would inherit land that belonged to the first husband. And they didn't want that. They wanted that land for themselves. And so it presented some major problems. So when we see that there is no male heir, Naomi decides that she will go back to her home in Bethlehem. Evidently, they got word that things were improving there, and they may as well go back. Now, her daughter-in-laws were an equal concern in their lives and in their welfare. Often when a woman had a husband who died and there was no brother, they would go back to their own family. They technically were not part of the family they married into anymore. There was no one to take care of them. So they could be released to go back to their own homes. And so they really loved Naomi. It says a lot about who Naomi is. She was a gift of joy and pleasure to be with, and they probably were in love with her. And that says a lot about the family of Elimelech and Naomi. She had to beg them to go back to their families, where, with their families backing, they could, as respected widows, could remarry into another family. Because they were both young enough to have children. But no, none of them did. They'd been married, but none of them had any children. So Orpah is convinced finally, after much shedding of tears and drama, and she turns back and goes back to Moab. But Ruth, no, she is a dear friend of Naomi's, and she refuses to go back and basically says, I am rejecting my past so that I can be with you, to the point that your people will be my people and your God will be my God. I mean, goodness gracious, that's quite a price to pay in any time. So let's see. Now, another aspect of the setting is that they were called Ephrathites. Ephrathites, I don't know how it's pronounced, but Ephra is the general name. Now, who is Ephra? And I thought they were from Bethlehem in Judea, so why do they call them Ephrathites? Well, it turns out that Ephrath, I know I'm pronouncing it terrible, I'm chopping it up, but she was the wife of Caleb. Now, that's way back during the wilderness days. And Caleb, of course, is in Hebrew means dog, but it also means, in terms of who he was as a person, is he was courageous, strong and courageous. And many people have associated Caleb with that meaning. And he helped to lead the people into the promised land. He lived all through the wilderness time and was able to see the promised land, unlike the other people who came out of Egypt. So Caleb married Ephrathah, and they had a son named Hur, and they were from the house of Judah. Bethlehem is in the land of Judah, and so Ephrathah, or Ephrathites, they were seen as having kind of settled in the area of Bethlehem. Now, where's that located? Well, we know about Bethlehem, but you probably don't know that Bethlehem is only about 5 miles south of Jerusalem. And everybody says, what? The traffic over there right now is so bad that it took us a good 20 minutes to go those 5 miles when Derek and I were over in the Holy Lands back in 2012, I believe. Right now, it is on the West Bank in the area of Palestine. And today, it looks like a ghetto with walls and barbed wire all around it. It's been walled in. Let's see, what does that say? I don't know, but that's where it is, and they have a long way to go. It took a while to get from Moab to Bethlehem. Now, the other key character, and we know Bethlehem is also the birthplace of Jesus. Remember, Joseph was from the house of Judah. And so he took Mary, where she had her baby in Bethlehem. They went to sign up for the taxes. They had to be counted. And that's where they were when Jesus was born. And Bethlehem is also the burial place of Rachel. I'm pretty sure of that, who goes way on back to the patriarchs. Now, what about Boaz? Who's Boaz? Oh, wait. Bethlehem, birthplace of Jesus, it means house of bread. Now, isn't that something? So you go from a famine, which drove you out, and you go home to the house of bread, a fullness to it, and things were good, and food and nourishment and safety. So Boaz was one of the key characters in this book, and Boaz, I looked it up, it means strength is within him. So you think about the general story of the Book of Ruth, and these characters live up to their name, but more than just the names that are written here. The names themselves indicate something about the character of the person who has that name. And Boaz means strength is within him. And that says volumes. And wait till you hear more about how Boaz responds to Ruth. Now, the end of the story, and I'm not giving the story away. You probably know this. Ruth and Boaz got married, and there was a long process in doing that. And they had a son. So here we have childless young women going to Bethlehem, and Obed, after she and Boaz get married and they settle down and have a family, Obed is born. Now, that's their son. And it means, Obed means servant of God or worshiper of God. I can't talk tonight. And Obed is listed in Matthew and Luke in the lineage of Jesus. Remember, the genealogy of Jesus is found in both those Gospels, not in Mark or John, but in those two Gospels. And so you have Obed listed. So if you're in the genealogy, you have Ruth and Boaz. They had Obed. Obed had Jesse, and Jesse was the father of David, soon to be King David. So from the house of Judah came David. And so David, King David the Great, was the great-grandson of Ruth and Boaz. So we're drawn into this story through a description of what was going on. There's a lot of wordplay by looking at the meaning of the many names that are there. One of the things that we say we know a lot about it now, we got this beginning point, but as we look at this book, we need to really ask ourselves what we don't know. What is it that we don't know? And why do we need to do that? Is because every last one of us, when we read the scripture, it's not just a document that we read and then check off and say, okay, that was a great story. No, we have to ask ourselves, what are we bringing to this study? Where are we in our lives that give the interpretation of what this might mean for us? It's not just a book in the Bible that we need to read and say, yeah, I believe that, but it's so much more than that. If we are serious about going deeper into God's Word and what that means for us. So we look at this and ask what we don't know. There are 4 sections in the Book of Ruth, and some of the questions that we really need to consider is filling in the gaps. Normally, we do this automatically, and we don't even realize that we're doing it quite often, but what are the assumptions that we make? For instance, when I read that opening, I immediately begin to think loss. So what I'm bringing is the reality that I've lost a sister in recent weeks, and that event, as sad as it was, has truly colored so much of my perspective when I read the Bible. I'm coming as a woman. I'm coming as a woman in grief. I'm coming with everybody else because we have all been wrestling together with COVID-19. Another thing that's very important, I think, and this is why I love these Bible studies, is Bible study takes all of our perspectives from where we are, where we can share in community together in a study what we see in the text when we come. So what is shaping my perspective could be very different for you, and you would read this very differently. So I see a grieving family that's been torn apart in a foreign land. And then I think, oh my, they must be really blue right now. And they're destitute. They don't have any men in their lives to take care of them. And so they're very vulnerable right now. And you might come from a very different position, whether it's a loss that you bring, or whether you just like a good romance and consider this to be a good romance, even though it's not quite as romantic as we may think it is before we get through with it. So we need to know, one, that it's good to be in a group Bible study always. That's why we love small groups in our church. But we need to know that there are things that are happening that we are doing that we bring to the text. And that's important. For instance, in the study itself that I took from the seminary, both of them said that the one passage in there that we think is so marvelous and beautiful was the covenant that Ruth made with Naomi, and it's very powerful, and you can see how it would fit a wedding situation very well, and maybe some of you had it in your wedding. What are Ruth's motivations for going with Naomi? Orpah didn't. She finally turned back and went back to her people. Um, did Ruth have other options? We don't know. Maybe she didn't have a family to go back to. It sounds like there was a lot of death going on in Moab. But no, did she have other options that could have been better and less risky for Ruth? Um, what is their economic reality? That's going to be looked at as well through this study. And economics has a huge role to play in this book of Ruth. But we know how to speculate. We do. But we need to ask what we don't know. And that will lead us into a deeper participation into the Word of God. And I hope you will do that. Now, there are only 4 chapters in this book, as I mentioned. Each chapter pretty much stands alone. Each chapter almost is like a different scene that they all play together, but a different scene that sets the stage for us. Not as a play, which is something I stressed on when we did the Job study, that we are observing. But no, this was just 4 chapters of the story, if we want to call it that, and they are, and this very organized in how it is laid out. It's often read as folklore, that it was written about another time and place, kind of filling in the blanks for the lineage of Jesus, perhaps. And it places it in the days of the judges. And that once upon a time, in the days of the judges, not to say that it's a fairy tale, these are real people, but there was a lot of speculation, I think, that took place in the writing of it. And it was placed in the days of the judges. And we know that it was unsettled time in Israel, that they were fighting with a lot of people, and judges would rise up and everything would be fine, and there'd be big battles in between, and then they go away and the people went back to idols, that kind of routine. But it's almost like a once upon a time. You find the same thing in Jonah and in Esther, that same kind of invitation into the story. And one of the questions that I think is crucial that we need to ask as we go through this is, what is it saying about God? And that's important too, and we'll consider that on its own merit. So we have these women. Women were marginal to begin with. They did not have rights. They were at the mercy of men, especially their husbands or their sons. So they were marginalized women. They had left, and now they're coming back. What were the feelings of those who saw them come back? And we'll look at that next week. So there are many feminine verbs in this small book, and that suggests something about what we're reading and what it means. The fact that it uses so much feminine language, it could be addressing a real problem that the Israelites who were maybe coming back from exile, going back to Jerusalem, where they were having a big fight in Ezra and Nehemiah. You can find this, and they were insisting on purity. And what happened there, if we remember our Bibles, after the exile, they rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem, but they also, if you had mixed blood, if you had foreign blood, you were not allowed to go into the temple. And what happened is people who were raised in the Jewish faith back in Babylon, they went and set up their altar to God in Samaria. Okay. Samaria. That means a place where people were not pure. And it makes me wonder, with Ruth being the great-grandmother of King David, it meant that David had Moabite blood in him, that he was not pure. And I just think that's fascinating. So was the book of Ruth written to make a point? that people who are not of pure Jewish blood, and what does that mean for Hebrew to begin with? They were the riffraff out of slavery, right? Well, it's a good question to ask yourself. Perhaps it was an illustration of a call to leniency in terms of the rigidness of the law against those from Samaria. I don't know. In that context, it probably spoke volumes. So it was kind of a rocky time, but it was a better time now in the time of Ruth and Boaz. Let's see. What's interesting about this book, too, is women are the agents for what happens. Are they manipulative? I don't know, but they were smart, and they took great risks seeking protection and care. So they were the agents of what happened, and we will see in chapter 2 how Naomi gives instructions to Ruth and how to make an impression on Boaz. But at the same time, Ruth follows directions, but then she adds a few more things that are kind of spicy, and we'll get into that as well. They use the name of God, but it's not until the end of the book where it is noted that God does something, and so they use the name of God. So obviously that is their base from which they're taking action. God is at play. But we don't hear, and God said, those sort of statements. It's a different kind of relationship, it seems like. It starts with barren women. I mean, Naomi could no longer bear children. Ruth and Orpah had not had any children. So it starts with barrenness. It starts with a famine. So the turn of the story happens at the very beginning when they decide it's time to go home, and there's nothing in Moab for them. So that's what it begins in. The Book of Ruth starts with famine and with hunger and with barrenness. The Moabites took in the foreigners and cared for them. They had sustenance. They worked the fields, probably. And that's another important word. We'll pick that up later in our study. But by the end of the Book of Ruth, you see that the famine is over. The crops are coming in again. There's an abundance, and a baby is born. So we have nourishment, we have new life, we have hope. And that is just a beautiful way to set the stage from beginning to end. We know where we're going. Now, what I like about this as well is women didn't have men to guide them and tell them what to do. No, these were women who just worked together. They worked together. So it's not just one person. It's both of them. And another thing that I think is very interesting is so much happens, is affirmed, is set in place by the community action. Think about it. I mean, when they come back to Bethlehem, the whole community when they come to Bethlehem, the whole community goes out to welcome them and greet them. The whole community. When she goes to the field, she's working in the field with the community, bringing in the harvest, which is a wonderful thing. It talks about the sustenance of the whole community there in that field. So I want you to pay attention as we go through this. Oh, the other one that's really big is in chapter 3, when Boaz goes to the elders of the city. In a communal setting with witnesses, they deal with the challenge of what to do about Ruth and Naomi. So those things are good to know. Now, Ruth is mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew in the genealogy of Jesus. She's one of the few women that is mentioned. Another thing to remember, and it will play into where we are in our own era, is Ruth is a foreigner. She's an immigrant. She wasn't Jewish, even though she was adopting the way of the Jews. And when we think about Ruth in the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew's Gospel, to see the women who were non-Jewish mentioned in his genealogy, you look at all those names in genealogy, and you probably just think, oh, well, it's nice to know your genealogy. No. What it's saying is these are all the people who have played a part in why Jesus is who he is. Think about that. And if we name our children after family members from the past, which we do in our family, we're making a statement that this is the character of all these people in the past who make up who this child is going to be, at least in our hearts. For instance, I knew right up front that I was named after my paternal grandmother, and her name was Rebekah. And it was important to my dad that I knew something about her. I spent hours with her in the summer, spending weeks at a time sometimes. And it was from her that I began to learn things that truly did make up who I was. It helped to give me some of my identity because of who she was. And boy, I can tell you stories about that, but that is not the purpose of our time together today. Now let's see. That is, one thing that I want you to note. Oh yeah. In other old, this is more of the foundation stuff, y'all, so don't get ahead of yourself. Let's talk a little bit more about Moabites. They were nasty neighbors. No, that's not what I want. Nope, that's not what I want. Oh, thinking about the genealogy and who's in your family tree. I mean, you got to look at the names that are there. Numbers 25. Let's go to Numbers briefly. In Numbers 25, foreigners were prohibited from interacting with Moabite women. That's in the law. So that's interesting. So the law was not kept very stringently, now was it? So it prohibited intermarriages or mixing with Moabite women specifically. And here we have a story of Naomi and Elimelech who make sure their sons are married to Moabite women. That's an interesting point. Why? Why is that in there? And Deuteronomy 23 talks about foreigners who were not to be welcomed in the assembly. So Deuteronomy says don't mix with foreigners. Keep them away. That's pretty harsh too. And think about that in the context of the Samaritans that I mentioned earlier. Do not mix with foreign blood. So Moabite women are considered questionable. It was believed that foreign women would lead people astray. And there's some truth to that. If you look at what happened to Solomon, he built little temples and shrines to his many wives' gods and allowed that in view of the temple, and he got in big trouble for that. So it's not uncommon for the kings and people of note to marry foreign women, even though it is specifically forbidden in both Numbers and in Deuteronomy. And that's important to remember as we look at Ruth. Ezra. In the book of Ezra, this is post-exile from Babylon, there was fear of being foreign, and intermarriage was not welcome at all. And I talk about intermarriage as marrying foreigners. How do we welcome the other? And that becomes a question for us. In the current day, how do we welcome the foreigner? who God specifically says in Deuteronomy we're supposed to care for, and widows and orphans. All three people are considered to be vulnerable, the lowest of the low, the ones in need of more help and compassion. So it really means that we as a church need to ask ourselves, who is not welcome in our church? And to remember that even in the Old Testament, the people were struggling making sense of what the law has to say and offer. So how do we welcome the other into our community? Another key point in the Book of Ruth that I want us to keep in mind as we move forward. I asked before this class in the leaflets, in terms of preparing for this class to take it, to read through and underline words that kept repeating themselves or just kept coming up again and again, or sounded very similar to what it was prior. And one thing that I want you to remember about those repeated words, when I was reading it through in preparation, one of the words that kept coming up to me was land. And who owns the land? The fields are mentioned all the time, and agriculture is the primary source of income for people. So remember that the land plays a very important role in this book, and we will talk about it. So if you see those words repeated, if you've done your homework, you see this, but go back and read it again. Remember, only 4 short chapters. What is repeated again and again? We need to pay attention to that. What does it say about the book we're reading? And with Ruth, agriculture plays a key part of the story, both from the very beginning, when they leave Bethlehem, the house of bread that didn't have any, and they go back to Bethlehem, where the fields are producing again. The fields. Boaz sees her working in a field. So anyway, the threshing floor, all those things are agricultural. So we will, let's see. One real quick thing about the fields. About the fields and Obed. Obed, which means to serve or to work. Cain, remember Cain and Abel? Cain was not the good guy, but what he did, Abel went out and got meat. He was a hunter, and Cain was the one who was the tiller of the land. He was the tiller of the land. And in Ruth, what we discover is that the land is redeemed throughout this book. The harvest is coming in, and it's abundant. People can eat, and they ate together, and we see that as they gather in the fields and eat their lunches. Community produces more than a single person can, and I just love that. Let's see, what does that say? And the law, and I can't place it in my mind, part of caring for the foreigner or the strangers in their midst was to let them glean the fields. And of course that means to follow after those who are harvesting, so that the poor, the dispossessed, the marginalized people could then come through the field after the folks who were harvesting and pick up what they left behind, and then they would have sustenance. And it was a requirement in law to do that. And we see how generous Boaz is when he tells them to leave extra for Naomi and Ruth by just taking out some of the sheaves that they are bringing in. So you have all these interesting things. And so with this background information, I really want you to go back and read it with this information in mind and see how it informs the story. We are going to focus both on chapter 1 and 2 next week. And I just really look forward to that time. In the meantime, if you have questions, if you have comments, send them to me via email, and I will look forward to dealing with those at the beginning of next week's study on the Book of Ruth. Thank you so much for entering this journey with me this Lenten season as we move closer to the cross. There's good news around every corner, even in the midst of tragedy. I love you. I will see you next week. Bye.